Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some Christmas book recommendations. Over the past couple of years, I've done a couple of videos just on winter book recommendations, mostly because winter is my favorite season of the year, and I love to read books that feel really cold year round just because that's my preferred state of being. So I'm not necessarily really a seasonal reader, and I also don't typically find myself reading for most holidays. I guess I do try to read some horror and some suspense for Halloween, but again, I tend to read that throughout the year. And so I was really racking my brain about this video because last year, and actually over the past couple of years, I have read quite a few books that take place at Christmas or are semi-Christmas themed. And so I planned on doing this video towards the very beginning of the month. And when I really sat down to think about it, I truly only had a couple of categories of books. So I had like Christmas mysteries, technically classic Christmas mysteries. And I also had Nutcracker retellings. And I just didn't know how much fun a video would be that just had those two categories. And so I really racked my brain. I found some other things that I could recommend because I did not want to just sit here and recommend A Christmas Carol. I, first of all, am not a big fan of A Christmas Carol at all. And second of all, I feel like A Christmas Carol is one you know about. So I was trying to think of some books that maybe you don't necessarily associate with Christmas, or if you do, that you might not have heard of. So I do still have a couple of Nutcracker retellings on here because, to be frank, they are some of my favorite retellings. And I also have quite a few Christmas mysteries because I also really enjoy that. But first of all, I wanted to talk about a book that I am currently reading. And this book actually really did make me want to film this video because I felt like this was kind of out there. I don't know that I have ever seen this book suggested as a Christmas book recommendation. And I'm currently really enjoying this book, so it really did inspire me to actually make this video. And that book is Eileen by Ottessa Moshfegh. And I know you're thinking, you can't believe that an Ottessa Moshfegh was ever associated with Christmas or was set at Christmas. And I am as shocked as you are. I picked this up on audiobook when Audible was having their amazing, fantastic 80% off sale last week. I believe I wound up getting this for like $2, so you just can't beat it. And I have been curious about Eileen ever since I read Lapvona back in September, I think it was. And also in September, I think I DNF'd my year of rest and relaxation. And it wasn't because I wasn't enjoying it or because I did not think that I would like it. I really don't know why I put that down. I think I was not in the mood for it. And so Eileen is Ottessa Moshfegh's first book. And it is a really weird book, frankly, as all of her books are. It's about our main character, Eileen, who in the 60s works at kind of a juvenile hall, let's say correctional facility for young boys. And a new woman starts to work there who is incredibly beautiful and seems really out of place here. But it takes place in New England in the wintertime. And so this is just kind of more broadly a great recommendation for winter because frankly, the book has felt very cold. How cold it is outside has been a major theme and a major discussion point throughout the book, but it's also set at Christmas because there's kind of a Christmas play ongoing. This is the more nominal Christmas recommendation because I don't think it's very festive. I don't think Christmas is the main point of Eileen at all, but it's definitely there. And I felt like it was a book I had never heard of associated with Christmas. So I think it's kind of a unique Christmas recommendation. And maybe if you're not really in a festive mood, if that's not really what you're hunting for, but you still want something set at Christmas, I think Eileen will scratch that itch for you. I think when we think of Ottessa Moshfegh, we think of someone completely unhinged. And that's exactly what you're getting with Eileen. Eileen is also kind of a really gross main character, let's say. I mean, I feel like we spent a lot of the book talking about things that is not my business to know. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like that's also kind of a trademark of Ottessa Moshfegh's writing. This is a really weird book, and I personally am really enjoying it. I do love kind of an unhinged woman book, and you never know where this one is going. You kind of don't know what the point of this is going to be. That's been the fun of it so far for me, is not knowing the outcome and not knowing where exactly this book is going to go. So I've personally really enjoyed that, and I think this is a great Christmas recommendation just because it's kind of out there. Since we're going to talk about Nutcracker retellings in this video, I think we do have to talk about the OG Nutcracker. This is by Alexandre Dumas, and if you do any kind of research on the story of the Nutcracker, you'll find that Alexandre Dumas, I think, is not the original person who wrote this down. That would be E.T.A. Hoffmann, who is a German writer, but sorry to this man. Literally, if Alexandre Dumas touched it, that's going to be the version that I go with. That's going to be the one that I read. And this is quintessentially Alexandre Dumas. It's funny, it's charming, it's quirky, and I think his voice, his authorial voice, just lends itself so well to telling the story of the Nutcracker. I picked this up, I think, maybe 3 years ago, and it's now a bit of a tradition for me to read this on Christmas Eve. I think it's just absolutely magical. It is longer than a short story, which I really appreciate. This might be approaching novella length, but the words are really, really big, so you can kind of fly through this. But if you are a Nutcracker fan and you have never read what the ballet is based on, I think it's really fun and really enjoyable, and it's just so charming. It is so, so charming. The Nutcracker is one of my favorite stories because it's just so quaint, and I feel like it's also really, really aesthetic. I love the aesthetic of the Nutcracker. That's kind of where I wish I was, you know. I wish I was in a land of snow that was in the form of powdered sugar, where lights were on peppermint sticks. That's kind of where I wish I was, and I feel like that's quintessentially Christmas, and it's also just really quaint and lighthearted. Most Nutcracker retellings are not nearly as light as the original, and so I think it's refreshing to read the original story. Something that's kind of in the vein of A Christmas Carol, if that's something that you really like, which is kind of an eerie, creepy vibe to Christmas. Frankly, I personally love that vibe, and I wish we had more out there like it. But if you're looking for something to scratch that itch, but you don't necessarily want to read Charles Dickens again, you don't want to read The Chimes or something like that, let me recommend to you The Night Before Christmas by Nikolai Gogol. It's hard to talk about The Night Before Christmas in any kind of detail because it still is a short story. It's a really long short story. I think it's around 50 pages, but it's still very easy to spoil. But I feel like if you like the vibe of A Christmas Carol and you like kind of the eerie, ghostly quality to a lot of the writing, you'll really enjoy this. I think a lot of us associate Nikolai Gogol with a little bit more of a lighthearted voice to many of the other Russian writers of his time. But The Night Before Christmas shows kind of his darker quality, I think, and also just in general his short fiction does. And I really like The Night Before Christmas. I read this, I think, last year on Christmas Eve. Magical. It was just perfect to read. In a similar vein to Eileen, I think you feel cold reading this. It definitely has kind of a cold, dark feeling, and it's just kind of a perfect read for when it is getting dark early. This is also a great one if you are trying to meet your reading goal before the end of the year and you want to read something really, really short, but that's also going to pack a punch. I feel like the Russian authors of the 19th century really had this down to a science. They're going to write short fiction, but it's going to leave you staring at the wall for hours afterwards. They managed to pack a punch in a really short page count, and The Night Before Christmas is very much in that vein. I feel like I really liked it because it was something that I came back to and that I continue to think about time and time again. So this is a high recommend for me, especially because you can read it so quickly. Now we can talk about Nutcracker retellings. I had a list of like 5 here. We just narrowed it down to 2. I felt like we did not want to talk about Nutcracker retellings for 35 minutes, but I personally love a Nutcracker retelling and I'll try them all. I have not found many that I think hit me that hard or that I think are that perfect. So I'm still on the hunt for what I would consider the quintessential Nutcracker retelling. So if you have any recommendations, I would love to hear them down below. But I have read quite a few that I really did not enjoy. Now, one that I did enjoy, but I felt kind of middling about by the end, is Midnight in Everwood. And Midnight in Everwood is a very interesting Nutcracker retelling because it doesn't take place in Germany or in Russia, which is where you would assume this is going to take place. This is set in Nottingham in England, which I feel like I would like 9 times out of 10, or I would like normally, because I kind of like Nottingham. I think that's an interesting setting, especially at Christmas. But to me, that really tonally shifted the story of the Nutcracker. I think it's interesting when Nutcracker retellings kind of deal with what was going on in Russia at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And so I kind of think taking that away from it meant that this was not nearly as complex as some other retellings that I have read. But I also just found this to be boring in places, I hate to say. I felt like this took a long time to get to the point, but it was really charmingly written. That was definitely the best part about it. Stephanie Garber blurbed this, as you might can see, and that was essentially why I picked this up last year. And you can certainly see why she would have recommended it and why she would have blurbed it, because it does definitely feel like it's similar to her style. So if you like Stephanie Garber, I think this is a great one. And it is kind of all about the ballet. Our main character is a ballerina. And I think that's fun because that incorporates the ballet aspect of the Nutcracker in a really interesting way. And I think it means you get to discuss the ballet in some ways. So I really liked this, but I feel like it could have been so much better. I actually want to reread this year because I just love a Nutcracker retelling. And this kind of felt quaint to me and sweet in a way that I was looking for. I think a lot of Nutcracker retellings decide to turn it on its head and go very dark. And this did this in some cases, but for the most part, it kept very true to kind of the sugar plum fairy aspect of it all. It kept it very sweet, pastel, very cutesy, which I think is kind of what I am looking for. So this is definitely one of the best Nutcracker retellings that I've ever read, and I highly recommend it. But I do think at certain points, this does start to drag. The book that I finished before starting Eileen was also a Nutcracker retelling, and it's a very recent release, and that is The Kingdom of Sweets by Erika Johansen. And I went into this with some trepidation because I have read one book from Erika Johansen before, The Queen of the Tierling. And The Queen of the Tierling is a book that I really, really enjoyed up until a certain point. She twisted it at the end, and that made me kind of go back and hate the entire reading experience because I hated that twist so much. And so I have been wary of her ever since, but this is a standalone fantasy that is a retelling of the Nutcracker, and it is not really a standard Nutcracker retelling because this is about two sisters. It's not just about Clara, but Clara has a twin in this story named Natasha, and Natasha has always been looked down on. She's not really the delight of the family. Clara is. And so there's a lot of sisterly jealousy in this, and that leads to Natasha making a deal with the Sugar Plum Fairy, who is not nearly as nice as you might assume. And the Kingdom of Sweets is also not nearly as nice as you might assume. I personally thought this was really interesting, and it has gone up for me since finishing reading it. While reading it, I just felt kind of okay. But as I reached the end, I really thought this book wanted to do some interesting things with the original Nutcracker tale, which I thought was kind of fun, but also made this really unique in the realm of Nutcracker retellings. This is certainly a darker book than Midnight in Everwood, and to be frank, this is one of the darker Nutcracker retellings that I have read, and so I would definitely keep that in mind. This is not really a feel-good book by any stretch of the imagination, but something that I thought was done extremely well was her discussion of what was going on in Russia politically at the time, and there were things that happened that were very like Avengers cameos, like you would discuss a man who was balding and who had a certain hairstyle, and you thought, are they talking about Lenin? And that was just kind of fun for the Russian Revolution nerd in me. And I also just kind of think that meant in general to me that the story felt very well done and that it felt planned out. I felt like there was a point to everything that she was talking about, which made this more memorable to me than some other Nutcracker retellings. I finished this a few days ago, but it's been kind of at the forefront of my mind. And when I first finished it, I thought, this was good. It wasn't great. I'm going to give it 3 stars, but the fact that it has remained so present for me makes it kind of remarkable, actually, especially in the realm of Nutcracker retellings. So I think this is kind of a 4-star, but this is definitely in a different vein, and that's kind of why I wanted to recommend it. I think this was really different to other Nutcracker retellings, and the tone was very heavy and dark compared to other Nutcracker retellings. So if you're not into that, keep that in mind, but I kind of thought it was unique. Now let's get into my Christmas mystery section, because this was one of my goals last year, was to read some of the British Library's crime classics that were set during the Christmas season. I just kind of thought that would be fun, and I wound up reading 3 that I really enjoyed. The first of these is Mystery in White, which is about a train that gets stopped on the tracks because snow is coming down so heavily. So basically, everyone has to leave the train and they go get trapped in an English country house, which is, of course, my favorite trope in mysteries. I think it's everyone's favorite trope. But don't you just love when people are trapped in one location and people start dying? That's good every single time, but I feel like it's particularly good here in the snow. This is set on Christmas Eve, if I recall correctly, and while they're stuck in this house, a lot of the people kind of want to do something just a little bit Christmassy to keep them in the spirit. And so Christmas is in this, but it's not nearly as Christmassy as the other 2 that I think I'm going to mention, but I thought this was really good and it was really different. That's one thing I have to say. All 3 of these crime classics, to me, had a really different setup and were really unique in terms of regular mystery thrillers to me. So I really liked this because to me this was different. We had multiple narrators. I just thought that was interesting. And this was originally published in the 1930s, so I feel like you know what you're going to get. It's very, very fun. Next, let's talk about Portrait of a Murderer, which is my favorite of these 3. This is the one with a really unique premise. And I feel like the setup of this book and whether you like that or not is going to determine whether you like the book or not. So this is about a family getting together for Christmas and somebody dies, but you kind of instantly know who did it. You get the perspective of the murderer. And I think that is so fun because the rest of the book is then them trying not to get caught, having interactions with other family members and pretending to be innocent. And so I thought that was really fun. But I've seen other reviews of this where people were quite frustrated by that because they already knew who the killer was. I just thought it was a little bit different, and that was refreshing to me. This was also originally published in the 1930s, and I feel like the 1930s just must have been a great decade for crime novels. But this one was my favorite that I read last year. It's very Christmassy. It's also very English country house. So if you're into that, I think you will also really enjoy this one. Last but not least is The Santa Claus Murder, which I loved. This was my second favorite, and this is about another English country house where somebody dies on Christmas Eve and someone is dressed up like Santa Claus who's been hired to come into the house and pretend to be Santa to give kids their presents. And he is the only person who is not a member of the family when this death occurs. And so it seems to most people that he probably just doesn't have a motive to kill someone in the family. And I just really loved this. This also had multiple perspectives, and it felt very similar to something like The Moonstone, where you're getting multiple different chapters kind of on the same event from different people's perspectives, where they're being interviewed by the cops, let's say. And so that was fun to see what each family member thought and kind of where they were before the Christmas gathering. But then you kind of shift over to the detective's perspective, which wasn't as interesting to me. I thought the family was just really convoluted and fun. And so I actually did not like reading from the detective's perspective. And that's why this was just my second favorite of those that I read. But I thought this was so, so fun. And it was very quintessentially Christmas. And the setting and the holiday played a really important role in the plot. So this is my last Christmas recommendation, but it was definitely one of my favorites. So that was a really quick video all about some books that I think are great to be reading here at Christmas. So if you are looking for something to read over the next couple of weeks in the Christmas season, I hope that you read one of these. I would love to know down below if you have any Christmas book recommendations, if you have any Nutcracker retelling recommendations specifically. But that is going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.